The discussion begins with an unexpected topic that sits slightly outside traditional areas of expertise: women's preferences regarding penis size. While it may seem like a simple or even superficial question, the reality is far more complex and emotionally charged, particularly for men who hear the findings. When this topic is presented publicly, the emotional reaction often follows a predictable pattern. At first, there is relief and optimism, followed by growing discomfort as the deeper implications become clear. This contrast creates what can best be described as an emotional roller coaster, driven not by exaggeration, but by data that challenges common assumptions. One of the most influential studies on this subject was conducted by Pross and her colleagues, who approached the question in a way that avoided many of the pitfalls common in survey-based research. Instead of simply asking women to state their preferred size, participants interacted with realistic, unlabeled, three-dimensional models shaped like cylinders. These objects represented a range of sizes and allowed participants to physically handle and compare them before selecting their preferences. This method reduced guesswork and avoided reliance on abstract measurements that many people struggle to visualize accurately. This research design is particularly important because people are notoriously bad at estimating physical measurements, especially inches. Many individuals believe they understand what 6 or 7 inches looks like, yet struggle to apply those measurements accurately in real-world contexts. When the objects being discussed are relatively small, even a 1-inch error represents a significant percentage difference. In a domain where perception matters more than precision, traditional surveys can produce misleading results, making physical interaction a far more reliable approach. Another strength of the study is that it shifts the basis of judgment from visual memory to physical sensation. When people respond to written questions, they rely on recollections, assumptions, or social narratives. By contrast, interacting with a physical object allows participants to focus on how something feels rather than how it looks or sounds conceptually. This distinction matters because sexual preference is primarily a sensory experience. The study therefore captured responses that were closer to real-life decision-making rather than abstract opinion. When researchers simply asked women to write down a preferred size, even consistent answers provide limited insight. A commonly cited preference, such as 7 inches, does not guarantee that respondents accurately understand what that measurement represents. Compounding the issue is the well-documented tendency for men to overreport their own size. This exaggeration likely contributes to widespread confusion, creating inflated expectations and distorted norms that influence how women interpret size claims over time. Because of this inflation effect, the use of unlabeled 3D models becomes especially valuable. Without numbers attached, participants are forced to rely on direct comparison rather than preconceived notions. This approach is widely considered the gold standard for studying physical preferences. Participants in the study were not asked to explain or justify their choices. They simply interacted with the models and selected what they preferred, allowing the data to emerge organically from behavior rather than speculation. The results showed that preferred length differed only slightly between relationship contexts. For long-term relationships, the average preferred length was about 6.3 inches, while short-term preferences averaged roughly 6.4 inches. In metric terms, this corresponds to approximately 16 to 16.25 centimeters. Circumference preferences were slightly smaller for long-term relationships, averaging 4.8 inches, compared to about 5 inches for short-term contexts, or roughly 12.2 to 12.7 centimeters. At first glance, many men find these numbers reassuring. Compared to exaggerated cultural narratives, these preferences may not sound extreme. This moment often represents the emotional high point of the discussion, where listeners feel validated and optimistic. Social messaging around size has long implied that bigger is always better, so hearing moderate numbers can feel like good news. However, this optimism is often short-lived once additional data is considered. When researchers compare men's stated size to their actual measured size, a consistent pattern emerges. On average, men overestimate their size by about 20%. This is not a trivial discrepancy. As a general rule, many men are roughly an inch smaller than they believe or report themselves to be. The specific study reference found an overestimation rate of approximately 21%, which significantly alters how preference data should be interpreted. This gap between perception and reality shifts the emotional tone of the findings. According to a large meta-analysis of 17 studies, the average erect penis length is about 5.16 inches. When compared to preferred length of 6.3 inches, it becomes clear that the preferred size falls around the 95th percentile. In other words, only about 5% of men naturally fall at or above this length, making it relatively uncommon. To put this into perspective, a 95th percentile trait is similar to a man being about 6 feet 2 inches tall. While not extraordinarily rare, it is certainly above average. In most large groups, there may be one or two individuals who meet this criterion. This comparison helps clarify that the preference is not unrealistic, but it is statistically uncommon, which affects how often it is encountered in real life. Circumference follows a similar pattern. The same meta-analysis found the average circumference to be about 4.59 inches. While this is closer to preferred range and length, changes in circumference have a greater impact on overall volume. Even small increases can significantly alter physical sensation. As a result, differences of a few tenths of an inch in girth can feel more substantial than similar changes in length. One of the most intriguing aspects of the study involved asking participants to identify the largest and smallest sizes they had ever personally encountered. Many women selected a preferred size that exceeded anything they had experienced in real life. This suggests that preferences may be aspirational rather than experiential. In other words, women may idealize sizes that exist largely in imagination rather than memory, contributing to a sense of unmet ideals. This phenomenon mirrors patterns seen in other areas of attraction, such as height preferences. Many women report an ideal partner height around 6 feet 2 inches, yet most have never dated someone that tall. These preferences represent ideals rather than strict requirements. In practice, people often adapt their expectations based on real-world availability and compatibility across many traits, not just physical ones. Importantly, the study also examined behavioral outcomes rather than just stated preferences. Participants were asked whether they had ever ended a relationship, at least partly due to a partner's size. About 27% said they had. This suggests that while size can matter, it is rarely the sole deciding factor. Most women do not view size as an absolute deal-breaker, though it can contribute to dissatisfaction in some cases. Among those who reported size-related breakups, the majority cited partners being too small rather than too large. However, there were instances where size was considered too large and physically uncomfortable. These cases were less common but highlight an important asymmetry. Being above the ideal range can introduce pain or practical limitations, whereas being below it typically affects pleasure rather than safety. This asymmetry suggests that there is greater tolerance on the smaller side than the larger side. While smaller size may reduce satisfaction, excessive size can cause discomfort or injury. The physical limits of anatomy impose a hard upper boundary that does not exist in the same way for smaller sizes. This reality complicates the assumption that bigger is always better. Some anecdotal reports reinforce this point. There are documented cases where individuals were rejected from sexual encounters due to being too large, with no practical workaround. These experiences, though less frequently discussed, underscore that preferences are shaped by comfort and compatibility, not just abstract ideals. Physical reality places constraints that social narratives often ignore. The conversation ultimately highlights the difference between ideal preferences and lived experience. Ideal preferences are often exaggerated, influenced by cultural messaging, and disconnected from daily reality. In practice, people are flexible, adaptive, and responsive to a wide range of factors beyond physical measurements. Understanding this distinction helps contextualize the data without overstating its emotional impact. The discussion concludes by shifting away from the topic entirely, transitioning into a sponsor message and closing remarks. While unrelated to the research itself, this ending serves as a reminder that the conversation was part of a broader dialogue, not an isolated fixation. For those who engage thoughtfully with the material, the key takeaway is not anxiety, but perspective grounded in evidence rather than myth.